topic's a pretty broad topic, and that is employee accommodations. Employee accommodations can come up in a lot of different ways. Can come up in the traditional disability accommodation issue under the ADA and Michigan's law. It could come up in the area of religious accommodation. It could also come up in the area of pregnancy, particularly with the recent passage of the Federal Pregnancy Workers Fairness Act. So we have a committee that is going to be able to talk about all of these issues. I'm not sure exactly how the panel is going to split it up, but the panelists that are going to be discussing these accommodation issues are Cliff Hammond, Mark Garner, Courtney Agusa, and Mike Gluck. So, Cliff, are you going to kick this off?
Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about religion and disability, and I believe Courtney's going to go ahead and follow up on the pregnancy and the new rules and laws that are applicable there. But yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the traditional accommodation in these areas and how it's changed pretty significantly in one respect, but not really that much in other ones. And when I think about accommodations, I think about the ocean, all right? The ocean, it's great. Everybody wants to have oceanfront property. It looks great. You can get in there. It looks like it's a lot of fun until the waves start hitting and you get deeper in the ocean. And next thing you know, you're like, I want to get out of the ocean. I never want to be around it again. It's horrible. I'm drowning. What do I do? And that's how the accommodation land looks. When you talk about things like disability accommodation, it sounds easy. Give people reasonable accommodation. What could be wrong with that? How could that be hard? And then 50% of my time is spent on the phone talking to people about, okay, I got this one, and you're not going to believe it. And I do believe it because I have these happen all the time. There's always these weird scenarios that come up, these one-off scenarios that come off for everybody that's different for one department than it is another department, one job versus another job, one employer versus another employer. Each one is individualized and each one's dangerous, right? Or it could potentially be helpful for an employee. Now, from an employer standpoint, we're trying to make sure we do what's right for the employee. There's no doubt about it. And a lot of people that are on this call are HR executives and people that do this all the time. And they know what I'm talking about here. It's usually pretty smooth, but until it's not. And then it gets really, really difficult. Now, what I want to start off with, though, is religious accommodation. There was a United States Supreme Court decision that effectively changed everything with how we handle religious accommodations. Not that a religion didn't have to be accommodated. There's a law that's been around for a very long time that says you can't discriminate based on somebody's religion. Okay, it's very simple analysis, right? You can't discriminate against a person because it's rooted in the Constitution. There's also protections that are there from Civil Rights Acts that have been around for decades. Very simple. But what's happened is the accommodation standard we use and the religious accommodation standard for somebody who has a religious need, they started to diverge decades ago. And what the courts and the agencies have allowed you to do as an employer is to say, look, when you have something, let's just say I need off on Sundays so that I can go to church because that's my sincerely held religious belief. And we had to find a way to manage that person's individual religious belief and the needs of the company, right? The company and the operations have to go forward. And so what happened was they started to say, look, if the request is going to cause even more than de minimis amounts of hardship, then you don't necessarily have to give that person their request. So, hey, if I don't have you work on Sunday, somebody else is going to have to come in and it's going to cost us 2 cents of overtime. Therefore, it's probably more than de minimis. I mean, it was a really low standard with the accommodation for a religion. It was pretty easy. Doesn't mean you could discriminate against people, but what it said was the accommodation, if somebody used it, had to show just a little bit of a amount of hardship on the employer. So what happens is that winds through the courts, it comes down, and there's people that say, I need time off for Sundays because of my sincerely held religious belief. And the Supreme Court said, I don't know what you people are doing. I know those court cases all said this. I know you've been reading this for decades, but you all got it wrong. And so we're going to say that we're not going to change the law. We're just going to say to everybody, including the courts got it wrong from the first place, and effectively we're going to go do what we do with disability. You got to look individually at whether or not this person can have a reasonable accommodation under a very simple test, very similar to what we do for an ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act accommodation. So you look at the person, you look at their request. and you say, okay, can I give this person the request they want? Sunday off. The Sabbath might be from Friday night into Saturday night. I look at all the opportunities you might be able to give that person. Can you switch schedules? Can you give that? Can you ask people they can do it? Can you work with the person to find a alternative job that they might want to work? Not that you're forcing them out, but they might want to work on the weekends or on the weekdays. How is this going to impact your operations overall? What's the cost really going to be? Can we hire or can we shift people in from other places? Are there other resources we can utilize to make sure that person can have that time off? And you say, well, okay, that sounds fairly simple. But if you remember, there was this big thing that happened a couple of years ago. It's called COVID, and there were people that said, "I'm not getting the COVID vaccine because why? Religious accommodation. I want a religious accommodation." And we went through this whole process when we were going through now. Now we've got this next step. Now there's been a mixed bag of whether that could happen. It's not really as big of an issue anymore, but it's an old issue because when the flu vaccine was coming around, we had people who said, I don't want to take that because of a religious accommodation. So you have to assess it. Now, what the law says is you have to have a sincerely held religious belief. Okay. And if you have that sincerely held religious belief, you go through it. The problem that we have is a lot of people say, oh, I know you. I saw you drinking at the bar for years. You're the wildest person I ever met. And they said, no, I found religion now, and I've got to do the following, or I truly believe this. And, people are allowed to change and have, sincerely held religious beliefs that are different, not only from what they held in the past, but they can actually have it today. And they don't necessarily have to have the mainline opinion of what their religion is. Just because this person has a view that's their view of religion doesn't necessarily mean it has to be the main line of their denomination or whatever it is, or it could just be their own religion, as long as it's sincerely held. And that's what trips up some people sometimes when they go, nah, I never heard of that. So when we go through this process under the new standards, we have to look at, first, does a person have sincerely held religious belief? Now, we can ask questions and make sure it's consistent. Is it a consistent belief? So if the person says, I need off on Sundays, and then they're posting on, their Facebook or their whatever social media that they hate religion, and anybody who has a religion is a fool. Look at me on Sunday. I used it to get ahead and get off the day. Well, obviously that person is lying, right? If the person says, here's a new one, I need off on Wednesday nights so I can go to choir practice. Is that based on a sincerely held religious belief, or is that just something they like to do? There are different questions we have to ask about. Is it related to the person's religious belief, or is it just something they like to do versus not to? If you have a political belief versus a religious belief, sometimes they get intertwined, but they are different and treated differently under the law. So what we have to do is have to be very careful not to deny somebody. So what the law basically says is, right now under the Supreme Court's decision, is you have to slow down and not say no. We had recent decisions that I've seen where people have settled cases where they haven't given people off on Sundays and say, look, you got a choice. You can have your religion or you can have your job. I don't really care which one you want, but you're going to take one or the other. That type of processing was potentially okay before, but not now. So we have to be very careful. There was a case that one time went through where a gentleman said, look, we're putting these new biometric scanners up. You got to put your palm on this biometric scanner because people are stealing time. And he said, look, I appreciate it. I don't have a problem doing anything else. I'll sign my name in. I'll verify anything you want me to do. But my sincerely held religious belief is that is in violation of my beliefs, because I believe that is part of Revelation with the sign of the beast. You're taking my palm print and you're using that in what I believe is a violation, or at least, contradicts what I believe in. And they said, look, we're all going to do it. It's across the board. It's even-handed. I don't really care. This policy is the policy. Wound through the courts, and ultimately what the courts found was, no, you could have given him a reasonable accommodation to do exactly what it is. It wasn't going to cost you a dime for him to sign a piece of paper. So we have to think it through. Is it really going to cost us a problem or more money to shift somebody into that role? And if you say, well, it's going to cost me overtime. Okay, how much overtime are we talking about? Okay, and how big is your operation? Does it really have a substantial impact on your business? So that's a new way of looking at religious accommodation. And there are a number of ways it could raise its head. Anything from wearing a beard when you have a policy that says you can't have a beard. Is a policy because you don't like beards and Mark Kerner? Or is it because you just think, oh, it's safety, we can't have hair because of some food requirement? So there's things like that. Then we get into ideas about, okay, days off, and we get into ideas about what, the type of job I can do and the duties I can do. And each one has to be unilaterally looked at, okay, on its own. That goes into the ADA accommodation. Now, the ADA accommodations, the Americans with Disability Act in Michigan has a very similar act as well that protects people. So large employers, or employers with 15 or more employees, are going to be under the ADA, and those below are going to still be covered by Michigan's. Michigan's law, when it deals with people with less employees, actually has some protections for small employers about whether you have to give people certain types of accommodations if you're too small. But the general rule in the ADA is, look, if I've got a disability, work with me so that I can perform the essential functions of my job. And what I tell people is, the first thing you need to know about the ADA is, what is the job? You should have a job description that you update regularly with what it is the person needs to do. Because if you have a job description that says they have to do X, Y, and Z, and they don't do X and they don't do Z, that piece of paper isn't going to help you. You actually have to have a job description that describes what they do. Worse, if your job description says you got to do X, Y, and Z, but they actually do 3 other things, but it's not on your job description, that's not going to help you. It's not necessarily going to be the end all be all, but it's not going to assist you when you say, oh, well, you have to do this and you can't do it now that you've got this disability. Well, how are you going to defend that in court when you got a piece of paper that says, no, it's not even part of your duties? You got to, blow the dust off of those things or create them from scratch to help you out. Now, the way that the system works here is, a person has to have a disability. A disability is some kind of impairment to a major life, duty or a function, right? So I can't walk. I have heart condition. I've got, maybe diabetes. I've got a mental impairment, right? A long-term lifetime mental impairment. Now, the rule used to be that it had to be something that was long-term, or, more than 6 months was a good rule of thumb. So if I broke my leg, in a motorcycle accident and it was going to heal, nothing else was going on, generally, that might not even qualify as a disability you have to give a person an accommodation for. But there was a recent case that came out, when I say recent, about 18, 24 months ago, came out of the federal courts in California, not here in Michigan. It said, I don't care whether or not it's short term. I don't care how long it is. If it's severe and it's something that impacts your major life function, then that can be a disability. So what we have to have is, the first question is it a disability? So we look at it. Now, if a person just has a flu and it's not going to go very long, or a cold and it's not going to last very long, that's not going to be a disability that you have to accommodate. But if the person has a long-term or something that's associated with the person's long-term disability or some kind of problem or ailment they have that interferes with them, then the answer is yes. Now, what are the types of accommodations you have to give? Well, it could be working with them for their schedule. It could be working with them to give them a break, to have a stool, to have some sort of equipment or apparatus like a standing desk, some sort of ability to bring equipment with them to help them do the job. But they have to be able to do the job, all their duties, their essential functions, with that accommodation. If the person still can't get their job done or an essential function of their job, then you don't have to give that person that accommodation. And now, let's just say the person comes in and says, I can't do the job. And you look at the accommodation. One accommodation you can give a person is time off. So if they can't get the job done with the accommodation they want, all right, or the accommodations you go through, you still might have to give that person time off. And this is where I get into the discussions about, can we fire somebody? It always goes like this. Person's out on FMLA. They come back from a 12-week FMLA. They still can't work. And they go, can we fire them? And the answer is, wait, let's see. Because under the ADA, you have to give a person leave. If the person can come back in a couple weeks or a couple months, their doctor says so, you might have to let that person have that time off, even though they've exhausted all their FMLA. That's because the American Disability Act says you have to give a person a reasonable accommodation. So it's very careful. This is one of the ones we get in trouble with all the time. And consistently, the EEOC has cases where they give big penalty damages, they come after people, or people just sue based on the state or federal law. So you have to be very careful about that. You can't force somebody out just because. You have to give the person a reasonable accommodation. Doesn't mean, oh, well, I can just send them out. No, you got to work with them. If you can't give them a accommodation, then you can give them that leave. And the law also says we have some power, which says if a person comes in and says, I want this because I have this disability, you can ask them for documentation, go through what they call the interactive process, where you go back and forth with a person. And if there's two or more ways to actually meet that accommodation, you can choose which one of those two you want to get. Now, what you can't do is shift them to the, you know, the roof of the building in February so that they freeze to death because you don't, you know, in retaliation. So there are a lot of ways that we can handle the accommodations, but what we see now in the laws are very simple. Employers who jump to fire people, employers who just move people onto a suspension or into basically an unpaid leave of absence rather than working with them, they're getting sued quickly. And there are a lot of lawsuits out there because of that. So we have to think through the process of accommodation. And the requirement of the law is that we interact with the employee and go back and forth to try to find something that we can reasonably. And finally, how do I know? You can put up a system and a policy that says, if a person has a disability, let us know. But that doesn't mean we can stick our head in the ground. If a person comes up and says, man, I'm having a heck of a time coming to work now. My blood sugar's dropping all the time. I keep passing out at home. And then I come to work and I'm late all the time. It's just, I feel like ever since I got this, heart issue, I'm just having a heck of a time. But they don't say they need time off. They don't say they need an accommodation. Well, if they tell a manager that, it's putting you on reasonable notice that you've got to do something. So if somebody tells a manager about that, you got to get involved. You got to start working with them and doing the investigation process. And so you've got to train your managers to be aware. So with that, I'll turn it over to Courtney to talk a little bit about the pregnancy, new statute that we've got, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act.
Thanks, Cliff. So this is what I would like to consider the sister statute to the ADA, right? It went into effect in June of 2023. But interesting, and I should say it went into effect in June of 2023 and became immediately enforceable. However, we didn't get regulations from the EEOC on how to implement the act until I think it was April 2024. And those regulations officially went into effect in June of this year. So we're seeing a lot of I think we're getting a lot more questions now that those regulations are available on how employers are to implement this act. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, I'll just give you a brief overview. Basically, if you're a private or public employer with 15 or more employees, you're a covered employer. In that case, you are required to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified employees or applicants who have a known limitation that relates to or is affected by or arises from their pregnancy or something related to pregnancy. So that's kind of a broad definition, right? And the statute does a really good job breaking that down. So who's a qualified employee or applicant? Under the ADA, there's one definition. Under the Pregnancy or Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, there are two. There are two ways to qualify. The first, mirroring the ADA, is that the employee or applicant can perform the essential functions of their job, whether it's with or without accommodations. The second way an employee can qualify is if they're unable to perform the essential functions of their job, or their ability to perform the essential functions of their job is temporary. The function that they perform can be performed in the near future, and there's a reasonable accommodation possible. The key point throughout all that is everything is temporary. So then what's a known limitation? Well, going back to what Cliff was talking about, known is whether the employee or an employee's representative notified or communicated a limitation or a need for an accommodation to the employer. It can be directly through a formal request, or it can be, in casual conversation. Maybe they're just chatting about and realize maybe something needs to be done to assist this employee to complete their essential functions. A limitation is different when you're talking about pregnancies. It can be physical or it can be mental. It can be related directly to pregnancy. It could be something that occurs after childbirth. It could be a number of different things. A limitation being, they're unable to lift perhaps during their pregnancy. Maybe they're far along and they can't lift anything, or they can't bend over, or maybe it's after childbirth and they had a C-section and so they can't lift different things. So limitations can vary when it comes to this particular statute. And then, like I said, pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions, that's really broad. And it's broad for a reason, because medical conditions of all types can come up during the course of a pregnancy, whether you have an uncomplicated pregnancy, whether you have an uncomplicated delivery, or whether you do have a complicated delivery, vaginal C-section, maybe you have a miscarriage. All of those things are captured by this statute. Even postpartum depression, if a woman develops edema, placenta previa, all these different things that are not normally captured by the ADA are captured under this statute to give an employee the means for reasonable accommodation, so long as obviously it doesn't cause undue hardship, like Cliff was saying, on the employer, and that's the financial component or the strain on the employees and things like that. So in this case, what is a reasonable accommodation? Well, again, it's similar to the ADA, and it's going to vary. And I think that's an interesting part of this statute, because what is a reasonable accommodation in maybe the first stretch of a person's pregnancy might not be reasonable later on. So it's going to be kind of fluid as compared to something that is given under the ADA. So imagine longer breaks, maybe a change in uniform, like Cliff was saying. Instead of a beard, maybe you just don't want your employee to wear high heels anymore. Maybe you have to let them wear sneakers or something. Maybe it's a food or drink related policy. This employee says, I'm getting really nauseous due to morning sickness. Well, a reasonable accommodation could be allowing them to carry crackers in their pocket to eat on the floor, or, a water bottle or something like that. It's going to be very fact specific. It's going to be case by case, and it's going to also depend on just the time frame of the pregnancy or the medical condition. The one thing I also want to note is that, there are certain things that are prohibited under this statute from the standpoint of the employer. That's including things like failing to make reasonable accommodations for known limitations, like what Cliff was saying. If you're having that conversation with the employee, they're not outright asking you for the accommodation, but something needs to be done, that could be considered a violation of the act. Requiring an employee to accept an accommodation other than what's reasonable under the circumstances or what was negotiated in the interactive process. Denying a person a job or an employment opportunity simply because of this temporary pregnancy or medical condition related to the pregnancy. So different things like that are prohibited under the statute. If something were to happen under the statute, now that we've got more regulations from the EEOC, we have a clear idea of how to take action, but the enforcement process mirrors that of Title VII and the ADA. And so we're seeing how that is being addressed by the courts now, I think, now that we've got the regulations. So I hope that covers most of everything. Cliff, did I miss anything?
No, I think you hit it all. I think that the one thing that rings out what you said and what I said was the difference here is obviously pregnancy is not a disability, so it's a different standard.
Yeah, exactly.
But unlike the ADA, this says accommodation plus, you have to potentially accommodate somebody who can't do the essential functions of the job. That's different from the ADA we're used to. Like, can you get the job done if I give you an accommodation? Here it's, well, can I give you an accommodation so you don't have to do the job? That's a big difference. And
Exactly.
Sometimes what people are doing is they're going through this interactive process going, oh no, I'm going to force you out on a leave. That's where you get yourself in trouble. You have to literally view whether or not it's going to be a hardship to not let them do an essential function of the job. So it's a big change. And I think sometimes people kind of breeze over that concept as an employer. Some people get a little bit too protective of employees. They're like, well, they're pregnant, so I don't want to have them working in this battery plant. Well, that's the person's decision. That's not yours. Same thing with the accommodation. Well, I know you want this accommodation, but that's a little too dangerous for you. It's not your job. That's not your role. You got to look at what the person says, what the healthcare provider is saying. If it's a medically related issue, you have to be very careful not to push too far back on the person too under this law. So I think, yeah, exactly what Courtney said. But that's the major difference that I see here is that it's before, during, and after a person is pregnant, and the symptoms and the complications that might not be disabilities and the inability to do performance of the job has to be weighed. And a lot of employers are very quick to say, you can't do the job, so you're off on a leave. Be careful.
Okay, thanks.